Wonderful. All right. Welcome, delegates, to this fireside conversation. We're delighted to be joined by Mr. Rich Lester, who serves as the CEO of the Boston Consulting Group, which, as all of you know from the bio we sent out beforehand and just from your experiences throughout life, is one of the premier consulting groups all throughout the world and is a fantastic firm. And I'm super happy to have this session moderated by my close colleague and friend, Emily Fan, who I'll give over the stage to introduce herself and kick off this session with Rich.
Awesome. Thank you, Zeal. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily. I'm a senior at Harvard College, originally from New Zealand. I'm currently dialing in from Dallas, Texas, where I just wrapped up an amazing summer internship with BCG's Dallas office. So I couldn't be more honored and excited to have Rich Lester on this call today to cap off an incredible summer. Thanks so much for joining us, Rich.
It's really a pleasure to be with you, Emily, and I'm so pleased to hear you had a great summer. That's true.
And I signed my full-time offer, so
okay, that's really great.
Yeah. So a brief introduction on Rich. He has served in the role of BCG CEO since 2013. He also serves as chief advisor to the World Economic Forum's Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders and is on the board of directors of the Business Roundtable, where he leads the CEO COVID-19 Recovery Task Force. So to get us started, I have a few quick icebreaker questions. But just a note for everyone else on the call, feel free to send in questions for Rich as we go along, and I'll make sure to leave enough time to ask Rich those questions during the end. Our first icebreaker question. So as the CEO of BCG, you get the opportunity to engage with many world leaders on a day-to-day basis. But if you could pick any one person throughout history to have dinner with or lunch, whatever you prefer, who would you select and why?
I think I would choose Nelson Mandela. The more I'm in the role, the more I come to think about leadership temperament. There's so many different kinds of problems or so many issues you come to. I look at what Nelson Mandela had to do to drive for the boldest possible change in a society on the one hand, and do it in a way that brings people together and build reconciliation and on the other, and to do it having been personally persecuted and suffered so much. I'm just in awe. The older I get, the more in awe I am of what he did. So I guess that would be the top. He would be the top of my list.
Absolutely. No, that scale of leadership is just unparalleled. Outside of books written by your colleagues at BCG, what is your favorite or the book that has had the biggest impact on you personally?
Well, I'll focus on business books. There's a lot of fiction I would rate quite highly, of course. I would, there's a professor at Wharton, Adam Grant, who's written many books. He's actually a great TED speaker too, if any of your colleagues are interested. But the one that's the most impactful for me is one he wrote, 7, 8 years ago, called Give and Take. And it's basically a discussion. If you assess performance in organizations, you can sort of look at people as givers, people who primarily wanted to help others, actors, people who are sort of quid pro quo, I'll do something for you, you do something for me, and takers, people who are very self-oriented. And when you assess performance in organizations, which they've done in multiple studies, unfortunately, it turns out givers do not tend to perform as well as takers and matchers. But interestingly, look at the very, very top performers in organizations, they are often givers. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what is it about some giving strategies, some ways of being generous towards others that allow one to thrive in an organization, even while on average it doesn't work? And the first part of the book, he talks about what are unique different models of giving strategies and how does it really help an individual to both help others succeed, but still enable them to be successful. And then the second half of the book is what do leaders do to foster organizations that encourage giving, that make it easy to attract people who are givers by nature and allow them to thrive, and organizations to outperform, because then you have everybody pulling together and it's not just individuals focusing on themselves, but the whole organization. And I thought it was so revealing about how to think about, organization, in the sense of what are the human behaviors we're trying to encourage? How do we foster organizations to do that? And for me, at least, it's the only time we had a book club at the executive committee. I gave it to all of the EC members in July. I said, when we meet in September, you have to have read the book. We're going to spend a whole night talking about how do we think we're doing as an organization? What do we think we can improve on in the way we serve our clients and the way we operate internally? And I think and it's the only book I've given to every partner at BCG. I still have a few to go before I leave. So one more tranche, but I've been doing it for many years. And so I guess that book has really helped me to crystallize a lot of what I believe really matters, which is building winning teams. And what do you do to foster that? And how do you create the cultures that enable people who really do that well to thrive and to succeed?
Wow, thank you for sharing. I mean, even though I'm not a partner at BCG, I think I'll be adding that book to my list.
Even now, it's, some of these anecdotes get old, but the messages stay very, very, very relevant.
No, absolutely. And a final icebreaker question. So we're halfway through the year already. How is your 2021 going compared to your 2020? So that could be as broad as you want, as simple as you want.
Well, it's more hopeful. I mean, the world is still in a tough place. And I think all the time about, communities that are still suffering right now, and many, including in the US, but in so many other countries around the world, with the pandemic still raging in different places, and the lives and livelihoods that's impacted. And at the same time, I think the idea that there is a path out of this, there are vaccines that are remarkably more effective than a year ago we even hoped that they could be, that in the communities where they are being used, they're dramatically impacting rates, that governments, though I think many of them have come up short in managing the health side of the pandemic, have on average done a pretty good job on managing the economic parts of the pandemic, and therefore the devastating impact on the world economy that we thought we would see, 15, 18 months ago, has not come through in that way. And that obviously touches, hundreds of millions, billions of people's livelihoods and their communities. So that's the pandemic, because it's sort of the top of mind issue. And there are other topics too. Climate is one that's on my mind all the time. It's, as you said at the beginning, it's probably where I'm spending the majority of my time right now. And I feel like there's so many things to be concerned about, but the awareness now and the commitment to taking action seems to be going up. We'll learn a lot in the few months as we head towards COP26 and what comes after. But so I would say I'm in a more optimistic place. I'm also in a bit more uncertain place. As you may know, I think you mentioned my own role as CEO is winding down. So I become our chair. It's a big, it's the biggest change for me in many, many years in roles. So like all of you, you go through life changes, and that things will be different, and that brings some uncertainty, but it also brings a sense of opportunity. And I'm looking forward to that as well.
Of course. And I mean, on that note, so a few months ago, it was announced that you would be officially passing the reins of CEO onto Christoph, October the 1st, I believe, after 9 years in this position. So what will that new role as global chair look like? And what are you looking forward to spending a bit more time on, whether it's, a nice cup of tea or something else?
Yes, I am a tea drinker, so that is true. but I'm also, I don't know, I'm looking forward to a few things about it. The first is, even as CEO, any CEO, and certainly myself, you carve out a lot of time to be externally engaged in the world, whether it's with our clients or talking to other CEOs or on topics that I care deeply about. But I think as a global chair, you're freed from a lot of the internal day-to-day management responsibilities, right? And so that gives a chance to focus in other ways. And there are three topics that have been a good chunk of my time for the last year, but I think will take on even more. The first is climate and the work with the World Economic Forum, with COP26, where BCG is the consulting partner. So I'll be in Glasgow in November and several other events leading up to that. And so climate, I expect for many years to come, will be probably area of focus number one. But COVID, I was hoping I'd be winding down by now. All the work that I've been doing with the BRT, we've been doing with governments and clients and organizations around the world. But unfortunately, our need to vaccinate the world is incredible. And I think as we now have vaccines that work, what we don't have is equitable distribution of those vaccines, and we're not getting to the places that need them, and we're not doing it at the speed and scale, and we don't have the supply chain and local distribution capabilities. So I think there'll be a lot of focus on COVID from a different vantage point than the first year, but at least as important a vantage point. And then on the US end, you know, the whole topic of racial equity has been one that's been very important to us and to me personally. I'm involved in several initiatives in that, but specifically one with the CEO of PayPal and the CEO of Vista Equity on Southern communities where a lot of racial disparities still exist in particular. And there's so much, corporations have pledged so much money to help, but they haven't known how to channel it. And we've been creating infrastructure with other organizations of how do you channel that to have the most impact. And we're just getting now off to real momentum. So one part of my external role will be like things like that. One part of the chance to engage in content again. You know, when you're the CEO, you get involved in some content, but you can't roll up your sleeves with teams quite as much. So now I'm involved in a couple of our big client climate transformations. I have a real passion for technology, so I've been really involved on the digital and analytics side, but there's this whole wave of deep tech that's just starting to hit that I think will be the wave that you all are talking about as, you know, people that are starting in this era of a decade from now, whether it's more physical technologies, nanotech, synthetic biology, battery technology. And so I want to get back immersed in some content. I probably didn't have as much time as I should have to spend time on. And then I just like helping teams and helping our younger colleagues. And so I suspect there'll be a lot of ways to contribute in both training and in various work efforts to that. So those are probably the main places I'll be spending time.
It sounds like you will still be very busy even after passing on those reins in October. But
my wife has a line that we heard from, I think it was Colin Powell, the former Secretary of Defense, gave a speech when he was probably about my age or maybe a little older many years ago, and he said, my wife told me she married me for better or for worse, but not for lunch. And that my wife felt the same way about me. And I'm trying, I love being busy, and I suspect, you know, and she's very busy too, so we'll have a chance to both do that for many years.
No, that sounds very exciting. And I definitely want to deep dive into some of those topics you mentioned as well, especially the climate portion a bit later in this conversation. But before we do that, I think myself and the rest of our audience would love to learn a little bit more just about your background and how that has led to where you are today. So I know you received a chemical engineering degree from the University of Michigan, and then you were Baker Scholar at Harvard Business School for all of the Harvard students on this call. Could you share with us the story of how you went from engineering to consulting at BCG, and just overarchingly, you know, some of the lessons you drew in those undergraduate years and how that has influenced your overall career trajectory?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's probably worth backing up. I grew up in Pittsburgh in the 1970s, which was as close to a depression era as we had in any part of the country. All the steel mills were closing, people were unemployed. My father lost his job for a while. It was like a tough era, and I went to college explicitly to get a degree where I could, you know, get a job afterwards. You know, I mean, it was just focused, and I loved math and science, and chemical engineering was probably the most math and sciencey of the engineering disciplines, more than some of the others. And so I did that, and I really enjoyed the courses. And when as a summer student in both my sophomore and junior years, I worked in synthetic fuels technology. But then oil prices crashed in '83. There was no more synthetic fuels to be done. And I joined Procter & Gamble because I thought it would be the best place to get trained. And I really liked the intersection of business and technology that, you know, they always tried to do. And I had a great 3 years there, meaning I learned a ton. The people there were very high caliber. But what I discovered over those 3 years is I love the problem solving aspect, but at heart, I'm just not an engineer. I'm not someone who enjoys being out, you know, making the equipment run and doing the things that engineers should do to do that. And what I really loved doing was wandering the halls in the research lab I was in and talking to people about their problems, and sort of just wander around and what they're working on and why, and we kick around ideas. And so I started to realize that my joy was in the hard problems and trying to find real solutions to them more than it was in being an engineer. And that meant I was, you know, I probably may not be in the right spot. And so I applied in school. I wasn't sure if I'd go when I applied, but I got in, and was waitlisted for a little while, but they eventually let me in. And then And when I went to HBS, you know, I was really looking for an environment where I could feel like I could make a difference, have a lot of impact, you know, and talked to a lot of firms and really debated what to do, and then ended up joining BCG for the summer and going back. And what I found about it, to be honest, is like, I love what engineers do around taking on tough problems. Around what do you really do to make impact? Not just have theoretical. It's not a theoretical profession. It's a practical. Like, how do we really get stuff done? But to do it with really hard problems that people haven't solved before, like that, I just love. And those among the main things that drew me to BCG was that sort of element around it. But I also love like constant new learning and new challenges. And the thing that I found specific to BCG, I think probably to consulting more generally, is like the challenge of the problems that come at you and the degree of change and the need to keep learning and never feel like, you know, you've sort of figured it all out and now you just execute against what you already know. And if you'd have told me that even 33 years into a career and 8 years into being CEO, that I would have probably like the steepest learning year of my career, because we're trying to figure out how to keep our staff safe in a pandemic, keep the business strong in a pandemic, learn epidemiology, because I was doing all this work helping clients and the BRP stuff on COVID, and trying to become a climate person and all the education that's, I feel like I've gone back to on, you know, from fuel technologies to supply chains to all these things. Like that sense of continuous learning is stressful sometimes. It's not always easy, but it's incredibly invigorating. And it's also invigorating because you're doing it in a team environment. And so you don't feel like you're there on your own, you're there with other people. And those are the things that, you know, I learned. And so I would say my undergrad, in terms of how to solve problems and how to think structured and disciplined about it, was incredibly impactful. But like I suspect so many of you will experience, how you apply that and where you take that. There's so many opportunities coming out, and the learning journey doesn't end in college. The learning journey kind of begins in college, and then you have to figure out the paths that where you want to keep learning, certainly in today's world, you know, about a career.
Oh, that's very reassuring to hear, because I feel like college students, myself included, we need to know, you know, what we're doing in the next 5 years, 10 years, but I feel like there's so much uncertainty these days that it's really hard to plan for anything in advance. So,
well, if I could just say, you know, I really feel for all of you. You've had the most disrupted, you know, I mean, that what you described is true for any student graduating in any, but then on top of all of that, you've had this unbelievable challenge of having your lives disrupted, your senses of community often, you know, the way you get educated. I mean, I do worry. I think you need to not put too much pressure on yourselves, is what I'd say. Like, you will come to careers, you're in great school, you figure it out, and you know, I think it's been a very difficult period. I honestly do believe it will be getting better, but I mean, it doesn't leave a lasting toll and stress on everybody.
yeah, for sure. You know, we're just figuring out our lives in this time, but we'll get there eventually. And I guess, so you mentioned you've been at BCG for 33, was it 33 years? So you joined during summer at B school?
Summer of 87, and then I graduated in 88. So I just,
Okay.
I mean, yes.
And you've been here ever since. Haven't thought about leaving?
Oh, everybody thinks about leaving. Nobody comes. This is the thing. Like, I think at least most people, I won't say everybody, who are heading to the business world, it's hard to think beyond a 5-year increment, is what I would say. I think thinking in 2-year terms, I mean, not between college and graduate school. Many of you will have a 2 or 3 year horizon. That's totally fine. But I think, you know, when you get out of graduate school, let's say, I think thinking about a 2-year horizon is too short. But most people, including me, you can sort of see 5 years off. It's hard to see beyond that. So there were a couple, not many, but there were a couple points in my career where I wondered whether it was the right thing. I had some interesting opportunities come my way. And, you know, you sort of, and the nice thing about BCG is I always felt it was like an opt-in culture. Like, no, I wasn't there because I had no place else to go. I could leave anytime I wanted. I was there because I thought I'd have more impact, people I loved working with, you know, building something that was unique together. Like, that was what kept me. But I think everybody thinks about it at different times. At least that's my sense.
But you're still there, and I know during your tenure, you're still there. BCG tripled in revenue, more than doubled in size. So a lot of, I think it's like over 20,000 employees today, and the BCG's footprint has grown from 42 countries to something like 51, and still growing. And I know this type of growth naturally comes with challenges such as in organizational structure, or thinking about things like diversity and inclusion, how to stay imaginative, how to retain the core of what BCG started off with and stands for. Can you comment on any or all of these challenges, although we might be here for a while, and how you've thought about approaching them and how you have approached them?
So I'll start with what changes, but I want to come back with what doesn't, because it's what you don't change that is about as important as what you do.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we, my entire experience at BCG over 30 years, which I joined the year BCG turned 25, so it wasn't a startup. It was already a very established company, but it's averaged, I think, 13% growth a year for 30 years. I don't think maybe there's another company somewhere that's on it, but it's in our industry, and I think in much of the business world, that just doesn't happen. And the reason I set that context is the only way you're able to sustain growth like that for decade after decade after decade is if you have a constant mindset that we do good work today, but the world is changing. We need to reinvent ourselves. We need to challenge. We need to build new capabilities. And that's been the experience like over the entire journey. And long before I became CEO, I think what was becoming true in like 12 and 13, as I was stepping into the CEO role, is that it was clear we were about to enter this next wave of digital and then eventually analytics and AI. That came a little bit later. But the role that digital and technology were going to play was not just going to be impactful in the tech sector, which had already been happening for many years, but it was going to be diffusing across industry and then eventually into the public sector realm as well. And I think we realized that in order to embrace that, it wasn't enough just to take a traditional approach to, add people in our normal practice setup and our normal office setup, but that we were going to have to create pools of talent that had more room to experiment, more room to try different things, creates cultures that were consistent with our purpose and values, but were geared in different ways. First, to building new digital businesses or digital ventures business, then to attracting amazing data scientists and data engineers in BCG Gamma through analytics, then to being able to take on the recrafting of digital and data infrastructure with our Platinian unit. And each one of them needed kinds of different talent pools, somewhat different cultures, but then to get value from a client's point of view, the client needed to see it as one BCG so that they were going to get the people that could build a digital business or take on the most challenging AI questions and problems, but they were going to be doing it with people who deeply understood that sector or deeply understood that functional area, and you could combine it seamlessly. So it became this very interesting challenge, on the one hand, to build new capabilities, and on the other hand, to continue to grow the core, which of course we've done very aggressively, and to continue to find new ways to connect different kinds of talent together. And I think that does not happen overnight. And the interesting thing is, for all we read organizational textbooks that tell us how you wire organizations, it's much more about trust, creating a common sense of mission, about getting leaders to understand each other and have empathy for what the leader on the other side, building a different capability, is trying to do, about continuous learning, because you try stuff, it doesn't work as well. So a lot of the culture that was in BCG, even though prior to 2013, we weren't doing so much in the digital and technology work, we were doing some, we had a very good IT practice, but we weren't doing as much. The cultural elements were totally well suited to a rapidly changing, more ambiguous, new capability kind of environment, even though the skills we needed to build required very different things. So that was the first part of the journey. And then the more recent part of the journey has been how to take that same mindset and bring it to climate in particular. Other topics as well, which I alluded to earlier, but climate is the same kind of thing, different kinds of skills, very rapidly changing world, but the But from a client's point of view, to get value of all of the depth of climate, they need people who deeply understand the auto sector, the energy sector, the banking sector, or operationally, how do you change a supply chain, or how do you change procurement or other things? So you need to combine those things together, and BCG is just so well suited to do that. So I think that plus just in having great people and creating an environment where great people want to stay creates the growth. But as I said at the beginning, the other side of it is what you don't change. And I think we ended up, though I didn't realize this quite at the very beginning, we ended up putting as much focus on how do we sharpen how we talk about our purpose, because it can't be confused when the organization gets bigger. We put enormous emphasis on communicating our values, on how do you lead with integrity? What does that mean from the newest member of the team to the most senior? Like, how do you do all of those things? And actually spending an enormous amount of time on reinforcing values, purpose, leading with integrity at the exact time we're trying to change so much of what we do inside the firm to bring all these new capabilities to clients. And I think the challenge is like trying to do both. It's never easy. There's no cookbook, but you know, you just have to keep working at it and realizing, you know, you can always find better ways to communicate something, to do something. That's what we're doing.
And I've seen a lot of this culture just in the past 10 weeks that I've been in the Dallas office. And I'm curious whether, from your point of view, it's a kind of a top-down diffusion of culture where the leaders, you know, have this mission of trust and integrity that diffuses downwards, or is it bottom up and also present in your recruiting process and like across the firm?
So I'd say a couple things. For obviously, you try as best you can to bring people in the organization and retain people who live those elements, who seem to be, you know, extraordinarily high integrity, who seem to be built around working in teams, built around being transparent in their communication, things like that. But I would highlight just a couple things. The first is, I do think as leaders, we send signals all the time about whether we want people to challenge us, whether we value transparency, whether we operate with humility and realize however much we may be skilled or have learned over our careers, we can get better, and we acknowledge that there's always room to improve. I think those values of humility, transparency, openness, accountability, continuous improvement, like you send signals as a leader every day, and it's not the memos you write or the speeches you give, it's the actual choices that people see, and then they see how you operate, and then they realize, okay, that must be how it really works here. But the second thing is, I think most, particularly young people early in their careers who are trying to figure out how does this place really work, they are looking for real life examples that they're close to. I will remember as a C1 to this day, so I was brand new, it's 1988. I'm working for a big client, and we came to the conclusion that their core business was declining like super fast, much faster than the rest. It was like on an S curve going down, unfortunately an S curve going the wrong way, and they were about to hit the steep part of the slope. And we told the number 2 guy in the company before the meeting that that was what we were going to say. And he said, you can't say that. That was the part of the business he ran. You can't say that. You're wrong. I don't agree with you. And you'll never work here again if you say it, whatever. And I remember the partner in the team meeting the day before, like, we're saying what we believe. This is what we do. And that guy got, like, apparently the back, I wasn't sitting behind him in the meeting, but the consultants who were like, the back of his neck got totally red. He was furious. And then his boss said, I always worried about that. And I think that my brother, let's dig into it in more detail. They concluded that we were right. It totally changed the dynamic of the relationship because they saw we would say what we really thought. But there was a bunch of young people on that team. Like, for all of us, it was such a moment of truth. And what I'm hoping is, and what we try to create is a culture where we don't just say these things that I was just talking about, but we have teams that actually see that in those moments of truth, people do the right thing and they say what they believe, they put the hard issues on the table, they act at the highest integrity, and that's really then how people realize, okay, this really is the culture here, and you can then expand it across a quite large organization.
Mm-hmm. Now that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing. And now, just to be conscious of time, I'm going to pivot to a topic that we've already touched upon quite a few times. In my opinion, the most exciting part of this conversation, talking about climate, I am an environmental science and public policy major, so I'll try not to get too carried away. But one aspect that differentiated BCG from a lot of other leading companies was the strong focus on climate action for me. And last September, I know we announced an ambitious pledge to achieve net zero climate impact by 2030, and after that to even become climate positive. And we also recently expanded the Center for Climate and Sustainability to a global scale. Was there a particular moment that galvanized you to put climate at the forefront of BCG's agenda, and how do you see this evolving over this critical decade?
Well, this will be one of your perfect examples how leaders don't always have it all figured out for themselves. In 2018, we've been doing sustainability and climate work actually for years, over a decade. But it was just like one of the things we did. It was a topic among a long list of topics. BCG is very good at and does good work. In 2018, we had a senior partner who was just relentless, along with a few others, but I give him particular credit, a guy named Philip Gerber in Germany, who just kept, I use no better expression, like pounding on me, like we are not realizing how urgent it is. We're doing the right stuff, but we're not doing enough of it. We need to invest more. We need to double down. And, at first it's a little annoying when someone keeps telling you you're not doing what you should or whatever. But eventually, he was right. He was right. And we weren't doing enough. And this was a critical moment. And we needed to step up. So I announced at a worldwide partner meeting at the end of 2018 that we were going to pivot and that climate was going to be one of our top 3 priorities. Of course, we continue on things like digital and analytics. We continue on all these other capabilities across industry and functions, but we were going to double down again on climate. And we did that in like 4 ways. One was we made our own commitments. First, to be carbon neutral in 2018, which means you sort of buy, to be perfectly honest, like relatively cheap offsets for the carbon you emit. But then with a much stronger commitment that I think we were the first in our industry last September to be net zero by 2030, and to, as you say, be climate positive after 2030, both by reducing our own emissions quite substantially, per each person in the firm, and by also removing, not just offsetting, but actually removing from the atmosphere any carbon that we did emit. And so that, I think, has put us at the leading edge of sort of commitments. BP gave us an A- rating, which is like in their top, like some small percentage of companies, and did that. The second thing we said was we're going to engage our clients on this much more actively, and ended up now worked, I think, with over 300 clients on their own climate journeys and what they do. The third thing was invest. What we announced is 400 million a year ago, but I'm sure Christoph soon is going to announce a much bigger number because we keep investing more in climate related topics and bringing our capabilities. And the fourth is engage with the world and really bring our capabilities, not just to our clients, but in other organizations. So we supported when the Business Roundtable came out with a big report about a much bolder commitment from the US business community. BCG was sort of helping them and providing a lot of the science underneath that. At the WEF, as you met, the World Economic Forum, among the Alliance of CEO climate leaders, we've been their leading partner on climate topics. We're the consulting partner on COP26, which will be interesting. I'm looking forward to being in Glasgow. We'll see what comes, and we should probably talk about that. We're working with World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We're doing work with the leading research group in the government in China, because China's a huge emitter, and we need to, if China doesn't make progress, we're not going to get there. So, and they're now I think they'll end up and need to go further, but at least we're starting to see, quite good commitments starting there. And so I think we tried to energize against those 4 directions. And the result of it is, I think we're now sort of a leading edge at understanding how these different elements, how does circularity combine with the energy transition, combine with supply chains, because most people's carbon challenge is in their scope 3. It's not in their own internal emissions in their scope 1 and 2. And how do we deal with removal technologies and what it will take, both nature-based and engineered. And so we're starting to have just this enormous depth in these areas, sort of like we built in digital a bit earlier, but now building it in this space as well. So that's where we are.
Yeah. And To push back a little bit, I know you've written on how companies with these very ambitious climate goals and climate actions can avoid things like greenwashing. And I know so many companies have come out recently with agendas or goals to become net zero, and just like BCG. But as consumers or as people on the other end of things, how do we determine what is legitimate, authentic climate action and what is potentially in the realm of greenwashing, whether intentional or deliberate?
It's so hard. I say this as a consumer at the other end too, right? It's not like you have automatic wisdom if you're in kind of the business world. I think what we need to be pushing for collectively, what we're pushing for individually, what we're working with the WEF and others to push for, and what we as consumers need to push for is much greater consistency of standards and transparency of reporting in this. And we've tried to model that ourselves in our own sustainability report, which you can find online, and we've tried to be a role model in the amount of information we share and how we share it. But we're going to need, as consumers, almost the way when you buy a food product, you have a calorie count, and the government has said how it gets measured, and the calories, the amount of sugar in it, the various vitamins. At some point, if you were a consumer, that's sort of like when I buy this car, here's how much carbon went into the physical product of the car, and here's how much this car is going to emit for every mile that I drive it, and which you get through some extent through mileage. And we're going to need that on many different products. And I think right now you've got two things going on. It would be naive to say there's not insincerity in some of the pledges, or people saying things that they may not be able to deliver, or they're not fully committed to delivering. I think many companies are committed to making progress. I talk to so many CEOs that I think are genuinely serious about trying to do this, but how to do it, how to actually do it, and how to make progress. And how to do it in a competitive environment, because as long as our government doesn't price, not our government, governments around the world, I'm not just putting this on the US, but the US is part of the issue. As long as we price carbon, as long as we don't make it easy that if you try to sell me a product with low carbon, but I can buy something cheaper from someone from another country, that the purchase just moves across the border. As long as we don't create incentives for innovation and investment, then even well-intentioned companies, just due to competitive pressures and other things, can't go as fast as we want. So, probably the main theme that I talk about when I'm giving speeches these days or doing things is, if there was ever a place we need business and government to work together, it is in this space. Government cannot get there alone. This is not going to be solved by the public sector alone. It needs the full force of the economic weight of business behind it. But business is absent government to set consistent ground rules, consistent measurements for reporting, ways to have carbon be a priced element, just like every other element that goes into a cost structure. Like, those things are just going to make it harder, and so we'll go faster if we go together.
And speaking on the role of government, I do want to make sure we leave time to talk about COP26. So for everyone on the call, just a little bit of background. COP is the Global Climate Change Conference. It's called United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, and it will be held in Glasgow in November. And as Rich mentioned, BCG is the consultancy partner this year. And I would say COP26 is particularly important just because there was the delay due to COVID, and a lot is hinging upon it, building off the Paris Agreement, which was COP21. And so since BCG is very heavily involved in this process, can you provide any insights into some of the behind the scenes, the drama, not necessarily drama, but any key goals or expected outcomes from this year's COP26?
So first, I don't want to overstate, like, the government negotiations that go on, which is the main part of COP, are not like BCG's involved in those negotiations. I don't want to leave a misimpression. I think we've been very involved, particularly in how we connect government to the business community and how to think about, making it an overall successful event. What we need is governments to come together to up their individual national commitments on. We need to sort of get alignment on tackling some of these hard issues like carbon leakage across borders, like emissions trading schemes for some sectors to make it easier for a whole sector to move forward, to create an environment where there's an incentive for companies to be first movers. Because think about, I mean, I'll take a very, if you think about the fertilizer that goes into agricultural products, that fertilizer takes a ton of energy to make. It's just very expensive to make ammonia. It's very energy intensive. It takes billions of dollars to build a green hydrogen-based ammonia plant, and it takes many, many years. If none of the consumers of that nitrogen, the farmers or the ag companies or the consumer products that end up buying the agricultural products, will commit to buying that 5 or 7 years out, it's hard to move. You need to support those that'll be first movers so that others will make the big investments. So and it's a really intense negotiation. And in all honesty, it can't afford to fail, but that doesn't mean that anybody, not Alok Sharma, the British lead for this, or John Kerry or anyone, can guarantee that it'll be a success. I think there's a seriousness. I know that this is one of the places where I think there really actually is effective dialogue, say, between the US and Russia, or the US and China, places where there's so many geopolitical tensions right now. I think on this, at least they're having real and substantive dialogue. We all need to root for them to be able to get some sort of agreements in place that are bolder than those initial Paris agreements were, and spur action. And the business community has a big role to play, both as an example, like real commitments that we're committed to delivering, but also as a challenge to government that we do believe you can still build strong economies and take on climate, and ideas and pathways in order to do that. And through our work at the WEF and others, that's the intent. And so I don't want to sound overly optimistic about COP. I'm sure the people that are the most progressive on what we need to do on climate, we're probably right about what we really should be doing, will feel like we didn't get as far as we needed to, but we need a step change from where we are today. And I'm hopeful we'll get at least some meaningful step forward on that. We'll see.
And to add some clarity for people on the call, so typically, COP is thought of as the conference where government leaders come together to reach agreements, things related to climate change. So where does the business world come into play in this particular conference?
So if you look at they just published, and by the way, the other thing that's the challenge right now is COVID still, right? We don't even know if I'll go to Glasgow, right? So like it's so many other things have been disrupted. But I think at least even if they don't let anybody else there, they'll let the negotiators come. They'll screen them, they'll test them, and they'll let the negotiators be there. At least that's all of our hope. Though I think, if you look at the way they've laid it out, they've got a day on energy, they've got a day on transportation, they've got a day on agriculture and nature, they've got days on equality and trying to do this in a way that is a just transition. If you think about it that way, the business community plays an intimate role in all of those things. So what we're trying, I think many leaders are trying to do, is you've already seen letters that have started from the business community about what action should be taken. I think you'll see more coming. I know you'll see more coming in the sort of September, October period around the UN General Assembly and other moments to try to spur action and to be there to engage with government leaders and spur them to action and encourage different actions that could make a positive difference. I mean, that's the hope. But the geopolitics of the world are complex even absent climate. So we shouldn't be naive in thinking like there'll be some kumbaya moment where everybody holds hands and stuff. And the one thing I didn't mention that's really important is the other thing that's challenging right now is a lot of the carbon in the decades ahead will come from the developing world. But a lot of the reason we're in this mess is because of the developed world. And we need to have the developed world provide economic support, some of which was committed in Paris, but not yet delivered, and probably more that will be required if the developing world is going to be able to move as fast as we needed to move away from coal, to embrace more sustainable solutions as they develop their economies. But they need to be able to grow their economies because we have people still living in poverty or just on the bare edge of middle class, and they need to be able to grow their economies. So one of the most complex negotiations underway, as I understand it, is the negotiation between sort of the US, Europe, the richer countries of the world, and the developing countries of how do we get the right support and can they count on it and what do they agree to do in return. and again, there's no guarantee we'll get to a good answer, but the hope is we'll reach some important agreements and government leaders come together.
Absolutely, yeah. I will also be attending with Harvard, so hopefully, fingers crossed, Glasgow will, a lot of it will be in person, and obviously a lot is hinging upon this conference. So we shall see, we shall see. And I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to jump into the Q&A. We've got a lot of questions come in through the live stream from our audience, and so let me shoot some your way. So
I'll try
the
to
first question, the first question, I guess there's one on the climate theme, so I'll start off with that one. Could you tell us more about the work that BCG has done to tackle climate change and sustainability issues, especially in light of the recent IPCC report?
So I think that, well, we've done it on so many fronts. So we're working, we serve so many sectors of the economy, pretty much the entire business world. We've done work on how do leading banks change the way they finance to factor carbon more into their decisions? We've done work with auto companies and how do they move faster to being able to make net zero cars and how to make it affordable. We've done work in agriculture about how can you get more carbon back into soil with regenerative agriculture practices, and how do you build ways to be able to price to reward farmers to do that, to give them incentive where producers who are still emitting carbon pay the farmers to adopt different agriculture practices to put carbon back into soil and still be able to get good yields in their farms and do that, which you can do with advanced farming practices, to work across consumer sectors. That consumer companies have often made big commitments on climate, but when you look at how much they figured out how they're actually going to take their packaging to net zero, change the way they source, do other things, they're often behind. And of course, work in the energy sector extensively, because a huge amount of this is moving to more renewable energy, helping companies sort of reprioritize their investment portfolios and do things like that. So, I know we don't have so much time. It's there's so many different, every part of the economy has to be a part of this journey. Of course, energy and some key industry sectors like steel and aluminum come, at the top of the list, but we need to do this in agriculture, but we need to do this. And just a final point, what's really interesting is if you take a single sector, take steel, the amount of cost increase you need to do to move to net zero steel can feel unaffordable. But if you say how much of the cost of a car is for net zero steel, it would add like $140 to the cost of a car. Well, you pay $30,000 for a car. It's not that much. And when you see sector after supply chain after supply chain in food, in cars, in many others, it only adds 1 to 4% of end consumer price to the cost of going to net zero. It's not that much, but the complexity of running all those supply chains all the way back is immense. So it's an economic problem, but it's also just an operational. Measure it transparently, share it, run supply chains differently. And so that's work that we can do extremely productively with our clients.
And I mean, the IPCC report, I feel like every time it comes out, it's very sobering. And just knowing that there is action happening across every sector, gives us some optimism.
Yes, but I have some optimism, but I want to be crystal clear, not enough action yet. And so the role young people play, the choices you make around how you signal to future employers, you're the hottest commodity in town right now. Like everybody's looking for talent. And like the choices you make, the signals you send to employers about what you care about, the way we all act as consumers, like the way we encourage our governments to set high standards. Like, I just want to be clear. I do think real action's happening, but the pace we need to move, and it's so clearly articulated in that IPCC report, is not the pace we're currently moving at. And we all have a role to play, whether we're in businesses, whether we're future employees, whether we're, as consumers, or how we use our votes to try to get us to go faster.
No, 100%. And I guess on to the next question. How have you and your career been influenced by mentors? Do you have any advice on finding the right mentor, from who to where to look?
Look, I think some of it's a personal thing, like who do you click with and who do you think you have a personal connection with? I guess the main advice I would give is like it. I think there's something about being proactive early in your career that you don't just wait for it to happen to you, but that it's easy to ask around any organization, say who's really great at developing people, or who did you get the best advice in your career from, or whatever, and to find ways to work with them or find ways to connect with them in a social sense in another way and start to get to know them. Or you've worked with someone and you really feel like you learned something from them, but now you're on to your next project, or you transferred to another group, or you've taken another job somewhere else, but you take a little bit of extra time to keep in touch and to reach out and maybe ask to have breakfast a couple of times a year. I guess I don't have great advice that's like, how do you pick the mentor? But what I do have advice on is I think sometimes people expect it's just going to happen, like they're going to appear. And I think that there's a little bit of luck in this, but when you find something you think is committed to you that you can learn from, then it's the onus is not just on that person, it's on you to maintain a connection and seek advice and show that you really listen. And I think that because people want to invest in people that they think care and value it, they're using it. And we're all stretched. We all don't have enough time. So you want to make the people that can help you succeed know that you value it, you use it, you seek them out.
Right. And I'll move on to another question. So tell us, this almost sounds like an interview question. Tell us about a time in your career when you challenged or questioned an assumption.
I mean, I feel like that was my job description, to be perfectly like it's not. I think probably the one I'm proudest about, which I think in a group this big, I can't name the company, but like for 10 years, one of the leading pharmaceutical companies was really, I spent years convincing that they weren't getting the productivity out of R&D they needed to, and it takes a long time. And sometimes things happen overnight. You just want to give a great presentation, and sometimes persistence just matters. And I think the moments of my career I'm proudest about are not the times I did some great analysis that yielded a really powerful insight. There was a few of those along the way. it was like when a client doesn't want to engage in the reality of where they are, and you have to stay on it. And I think particularly working in innovation, it's so hard to get value out of innovation, particularly in big organizations. It's so can lose so much value along the way. So I feel like helping to turn around the R&D organization of a major company, which is now in a totally different place on that, or some of the work that we did on turning around underperforming businesses. I guess those are ones that I look back on.
Okay, awesome.
You can't go into quite as much detail, I guess.
No, I understand challenging assumptions is part of the daily job. And I have another question. It sounds like this person is wanting to be employed by BCG, but they asked, what qualities and skills do you look for in a potential employee? Or maybe even to reword it, what is some valuable advice you'd offer for students who are, interviewing for jobs, wanting to find the best fit for themselves?
So I would say three things. One, every generation of young people, but even more your generation, have to go into your roles as like being in a continuous learning mindset. The world is changing fast around you. The technologies that are coming along are going to be very different even a few years out. And you need, today more than ever, we need cross-functional mindsets and capabilities to make things happen. And going into your role, and we look for people who we think don't just want to show us how much they know, but have the ability to know what they don't know and to want to seek out new information and to learn. I think the second is real impact comes from teams. And whether you're the youngest person on the team or the most senior, an ability to work and be a part of creating high-performing teams where you work together to align on what the goals are, where you're willing to challenge each other even when it's uncomfortable, where you're supportive of each other and you're looking to make each person better around you and deliver as a team, where the success is the success of a group, not just about your own individual accolades, would be the second. And the third would be recognizing how much technology is influencing everything. You do not have to be a software programmer. You do not have to know how to do chip design, but all of us in our roles have to recognize between AI and robotics and digital and all of and the new technologies that are coming, to have some comfort with technology, to early on get some exposure from whatever vantage point you want to take. It could be, how do you do marketing with more personalization technology to build more relationships? It could be how to optimize supply chains with AI. It could be, you can come at it from different angles, but to recognize the role that technology is playing and to get comfortable with it, it will reshape each of our careers. Whether you're my age or your age, we will all see changes in the years ahead around that. So I guess I would say, and we're looking for people that want to solve the hardest problems, want to do it in teams, high purpose and values, want to grow and learn.
Mhm. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I think we're all trying to internalize that. And with that, I'd like to wrap up today's Fireside conversation with Rich Lesser. I know it's late on your end, I believe. You're in New York right now. So I hope you get a good night's sleep after this, but I've certainly learned a lot from what you've shared, and I'm sure everyone else tuning in here and on the live stream has as well. So thank you so much for being here with us. We really, really appreciate you taking the time.
It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I wish you a great next year, and I hope it can feel like a more normal year. And also, I hope that this is a wonderful conference and you can all learn a lot from it. Have a good day or evening.